Wittgenstein's Tractatus is one of the most baffling and mysterious and mystical and brilliant and difficult works of philosophy ever written. It baffles pretty much everyone who's ever picked it up. But the main ideas, the main lines of thought are actually relatively simple to explain. So that's what I'm going to try and do in this video today, and we're going to get going with that right now. Ludwig Wittgenstein produced two great works of philosophy. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921-22, and the Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously in 1953. The Tractatus is a very, very unusual work of philosophy. It's a remarkably short work for a great work of philosophy. And that's in part due to Wittgenstein's condensed writing style, which has put off many readers and confused a good number of philosophers. So Wittgenstein wanted to express himself in as concise and as logical a way as possible. He was influenced in that by the work of the great logicians, particularly Frege. Whether he was successful in this, well, you got to read it and judge for yourself. The Tractatus is also unusual in its layout. So its paragraphs use a system of decimal notation which aims to make explicit whether a new paragraph expands on the previous one or whether it's making a brand new point. The Tractatus contains a range of different philosophical topics, but we can divide it up into four main areas. There's the metaphysics of objects, Wittgenstein's idea that the world is made up of facts, not of things. Then there's his picture theory of language. And related to that, there's his philosophical account of meaning and meaninglessness. And then there's his reflections on the purpose of philosophy. Before we go any further, I'd just like to jump in here and say I hope you're enjoying this content. If you'd like to help me out to make more educational academic content like this, go and take a look at my Ko-Fi page and see how you can help me out. So let's start where the Tractatus starts, with the metaphysics, the logical structure of reality. The Tractatus begins with these words: "The world is all that is the case. The world is the totality of facts, not of things. The world is determined by facts, and by there being all the facts. For the totality of facts determines what is the case, and also whatever is not the case." You see what I mean about this being really complicated to read? What on earth does Wittgenstein mean by that? Well, really what he's talking about here is the way the world is, okay? By fact, Wittgenstein doesn't mean something in language, a true sentence, like we would often say that's a fact. He means something like a state of affairs, something in the world. The world being a certain way, like I am sitting down right now, that is one fact. It's sunny outside in Nottingham right now, that is another fact. These are all different facts, and together, Wittgenstein says, these facts make up the world, what we mean by reality. And the contrast here that he brings out is it's not just things or objects that make up reality. You know, me, you, the camera, and stuff like that. Because if we just had things, we would just have a collection of stuff, right? What's important when we think about reality is not just the things, but the way those things are, the properties they have, like me sitting down, like the camera being on, and the relationships between them. I'm talking into the camera, you're watching me talk into the camera, and so on. All of these facts together make up the totality of reality. So this way of thinking of the world, breaking it down into its constituent facts, is basically related to the logical atomism that Wittgenstein developed alongside his teacher, Bertrand Russell. Russell taught Wittgenstein when Wittgenstein was an undergraduate at Cambridge in the early decades of the 20th century. 1912 he started there, and they became friends and they worked closely together on philosophy, developing this idea of logical atomism. So atomism in general is the view that the world is made up of distinct units of existence, and logical atomism adds to the view that this view is arrived at through logical means rather than through empirical investigation. Through logical means we can break down facts into their basic constituents. And really, this is one of the peculiar traits of Wittgenstein's approach. In the Tractatus, he simply insists that if thought and language are to represent the world, then thought, language, and the world must be structured in the same way. This would only be possible, according to Wittgenstein, if there were basic units of existence, the states of affairs, that could be picked out by the basic elements of our language, the primitive propositions. The picture theory. So Wittgenstein puts forward what he calls the picture theory of meaning. The idea, very roughly speaking, is that the function of language is to form pictures or models of reality. That's how language gets its meaning. So Wittgenstein develops an account of how language works, of how it gets its meaning, based on an analogy with the way he thinks about pictures. So although pictures can have many purposes, it really helps to focus in on a very basic type of picture or diagram, like, if I'm trying to show you the way to drive to my house, I might sketch you a quick diagram. And to do that, I don't have to include every detail along the way, like, what the view's going to look like or anything like that. I might just draw a very basic diagram showing you, like, here's where you live, here's the road in between, here's where I live, and there's the traffic lights, you're going to turn left at the lights, and I might draw this by putting little arrows on the road, or whatever. So a diagram like this presents a situation to us, according to Wittgenstein. It tells us that certain things are the case, and certain other things are not the case. So suppose my diagram indicates that to get to my house, you've got to take the second right after the lights. The diagram is presenting a situation in which my house is on that very road. It tells us that it's not the case that my house is the second left after the lights. So this is basically what Wittgenstein means when he says a picture is a model of reality. So in constructing a picture like this, we're not constrained by what is actually the case, by the facts, by the actual facts. Although my house is on the second road on the right, let's say, I'm perfectly able to draw a diagram in which the house is on the second left after the lights. So the situation that a picture presents thus exists in logical space, according to Wittgenstein. It's existing in the space of all possibilities, not necessarily just corresponding to the actual situation of how things really are. A picture represents a possible situation when the structure of the picture mirrors the structure of that situation. So in our example, that would mean that when I draw parallel lines quite close together in the diagram, they're representing the road, and when I draw a little symbol with a little kind of hat on it, that's going to represent the house, and a little rectangle that I draw with some circles in it, that's going to represent the traffic lights. And if I put some arrows on it, they're not really representing any feature of reality other than that's the way you should go to get to my house. So here we have various symbols corresponding to objects in reality, and moreover, the way in which the symbols are related in the picture mirrors the way in which the corresponding objects are related in the given situation, real or merely possible. So in this way, Wittgenstein says, the meaning and the truth or the falsity are two different aspects of the picture. So the meaning, or as Wittgenstein sometimes calls it, the sense of the picture, is the situation that it represents. Whereas on the other hand, the agreement or disagreement of its sense with reality constitutes its truth or falsity. So we can usually tell what a picture means just by looking at it, if we're familiar with the notation that's being used. But in order to tell whether a picture is true or false, we must compare it with reality. We must actually look and see what the picture represents, and whether that's actually the case or not. So according to Wittgenstein, language works in pretty much exactly the same way. So we're setting up this analogy between language, the way language works, and the way pictures represent reality. So according to Wittgenstein, in the Tractatus, language gets its meaning pretty much wholly by representing possible states of affairs in logical space. Meaning and nonsense. So according to the picture theory, it's the job of meaningful language to picture actual or possible states of affairs. So for Wittgenstein, logic sets the limits to meaning. The tautologies and contradictions of logic are not themselves meaningful. They are limiting cases, without sense. Wittgenstein treats mathematics the same way. But other cases have an even deeper grade of meaninglessness, being utterly nonsensical. To understand them, Wittgenstein says, we should have to be able to station ourselves with propositions somewhere outside logic, that is to say, outside the world. And Wittgenstein thinks that a consequence of this is that language which doesn't picture any concrete state of affairs is going to be meaningless. So one of the main aims of the Tractatus, it becomes apparent, is to show what is meaningful and what is not. So in the preface to the Tractatus, Wittgenstein writes, "This book will draw a limit to thinking, or rather, not to thinking, but to the expression of thoughts. The limit can only be drawn in language, and what lies on the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense." So here Wittgenstein includes any talk about value, including ethics, religion, and philosophy itself. Language can't meaningfully address these issues. Wittgenstein thinks that value somehow lies outside the world, and famously he says, "The limits of language mean the limits of my world." And in particular, as Wittgenstein was very well aware, the Tractatus itself is meaningless. The very theory that Wittgenstein seems to be putting forward here about how language gets meaning is itself meaningless by its own lights. Wittgenstein is very aware of this. But that doesn't mean that he thinks that philosophy itself is pointless. According to Wittgenstein, the Tractatus is an elucidatory activity. By this he means that anyone who comes to understand the Tractatus thereby understands that it's senseless. But since understanding has been achieved, one no longer needs the propositions of the Tractatus. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. So in this way, it doesn't matter that the Tractatus is meaningless. Its value is in the activity of reading through it, thinking through it, and coming to understand it, not in its content. So a key idea here for Wittgenstein is the distinction that he draws between saying and showing. So according to Wittgenstein, often we can't say such and such, but we can show it. So according to Wittgenstein, there are important things that we can't meaningfully say in language, but nevertheless we can show them. Wittgenstein says, what finds its reflection in language, language cannot represent. What expresses itself in language, we cannot express by means of language. Propositions show the logical form of reality. They display it. By showing that a number of propositions that we might otherwise take to be meaningful are actually nonsense, Wittgenstein hoped that philosophy could lead to the clarification of our thoughts. So what Wittgenstein's trying to do here really is to show that there are a number of propositions that we might otherwise take to be meaningful, but to be philosophically problematic. And what he's really trying to show us here is that really these propositions are just meaningless, right? And then if they're meaningless, well, they can't really be problems, because if they were problems, we would be able to meaningfully express those problems in language. But we can't, so they're not. The purpose of philosophy. This, according to Wittgenstein, is the object of philosophy. Okay, so Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy really differs from many traditional views of what philosophy is, which go right back to ancient times. So on many conceptions of philosophy, what we're trying to do is we're trying to use rational thought to clarify problems and to solve problems, to come to an understanding of the way reality is, perhaps in its most fundamental aspects, by using our rational thought to solve those problems. But that's not how it is on Wittgenstein's conception of what philosophy is. Rather, for Wittgenstein, philosophy is not a body of doctrine, but an activity. A philosophical work consists essentially of elucidations. Philosophy does not result in philosophical propositions, but rather in the clarification of propositions. So Wittgenstein then concludes with his seventh thesis, to which he offers no further explanation. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The empiricist interpretation. Okay, so let's break off for a moment from what Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus to one way in which it can be interpreted and whether that interpretation is right or wrong. So there's an influential interpretation of the Tractatus that tries to place it along empiricist lines. So empiricism in philosophy, it's a viewpoint in epistemology and the theory of knowledge that says ultimately all our knowledge and understanding of the world comes from our experience. We don't have any a priori knowledge that we get, independently of our experience. To understand the world, to gain knowledge, we have to go out there and really experience the world from scratch. Without any experience, our mind is just a blank slate to be filled up and then systematized with experience. So one person who attempts this empiricist interpretation of the Tractatus was Karl Popper, who was an influential philosopher of science. Okay, so he attempts to interpret the Tractatus as an empiricist doctrine. Popper sums up the Tractatus as follows. All genuine or meaningful propositions were truth functions of the elementary or atomic propositions, which described atomic facts, which could be in principle established or rejected by observation. Okay, so that's a pretty accurate summary of the Tractatus up to the point where we get to which could in principle be established or rejected by observation. So this last bit is added by Popper and it's not in the Tractatus. The phrase observation statement, which is a key idea in empiricism, doesn't occur anywhere in the Tractatus. Wittgenstein just isn't really concerned with epistemology. He's not concerned really with the theory of knowledge. He hardly talks about it at all. It seems to me that Wittgenstein made a purposeful decision to exclude any discussion of any epistemic, any matters relating to the theory of knowledge from the Tractatus. Okay, and because of that, we can't really attribute this epistemic interpretation of the Tractatus to Wittgenstein. I just don't think it's an accurate understanding of what Wittgenstein was trying to do at all. Nevertheless, the empiricist interpretation of the picture theory of meaning was itself influential as an understanding of the Tractatus. So the empiricist interpretation, it was picked up by the logical-positivist philosophers of the Vienna Circle. So that's including philosophers like Maurice Schlick, Frederick Weissman, and Rudolf Carnap. So these philosophers, they assumed that Wittgenstein was supporting the verification principle, the principle that only those propositions that are empirically verifiable are meaningful. So according to verificationists, according to the verificationist principle, there's a large class of propositions, including ones about ethics and theology and philosophy, that aren't verifiable and hence aren't meaningful. Now, Wittgenstein does agree with this. He does agree that there's a large class of propositions, including ethics and theology and lots of philosophy, and that stuff just isn't meaningful. But Wittgenstein gets to this conclusion for rather different reasons than the verificationists. He's not really an adherent of the verificationist principle. He's got quite a different theory of meaning. He doesn't say that for something to be meaningful, it has to be verifiable. Rather, he's saying, I've got this picture theory of meaning that sets out the limits of meaning, and whatever lies on the other side of those limits is meaningless. So, Wittgenstein is not really a verificationist. The Tractatus is one of the masterpieces of analytic philosophy. In terms of its influence on later philosophy, the picture is kind of difficult to assess, not least because it wasn't that long from the publication of the Tractatus to the publication of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, where he basically takes back a lot of the viewpoints that he expresses in the Tractatus. So he was basically disavowing his own philosophy. And I think it's fair to say that Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations and the picture of philosophy that he presents in the philosophical investigations really set the tone for analytic philosophy, philosophy of language in the second half of the 20th century. So in some sense, the philosophical investigations overshadowed the influence of the Tractatus. Nevertheless, there are lots of individual bits of the Tractatus that went on to influence important bits of analytic philosophy. On the metaphysics side, there is the metaphysics of states of affairs, which influenced people like David Armstrong. There's the account of meaning, which went on to influence lots of philosophers and linguists. Perhaps not the picture theory of meaning itself, but Wittgenstein's broader idea that we understand the meaning of a sentence in terms of its possible truth values, its truth conditions. That's a really, really influential idea in analytic philosophy of language and linguistics. The way we relate the meaning or content of a sentence to the possible situations or the possible worlds at which that sentence is true, that's a really influential idea in modal logic and the kind of areas of philosophy that tie in nicely with modal logic. So analytic philosophy of language. Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy as something that is ultimately meaningless but that somehow it's okay to say that it's meaningless, or rather to show that it's meaningless, I think has had a much more mixed reaction. Frank Ramsey, in his critical notice of the Tractatus, I think expresses this idea, this criticism the best, when he says, what we can't say, or we can't whistle it either. So Wittgenstein was known at the time for being a very proficient whistler. He could whistle his way accurately through an entire symphony. And what Ramsey is really saying here is, you know, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't say that this stuff, this philosophy, is somehow important, but also say that it's meaningless, right? If it's going to be important, it has to mean something. And, you know, I guess he's saying philosophy is important, and thus it is meaningful. So Wittgenstein's theory that says philosophy isn't meaningful, well, there's something wrong with that. But, you know, I think this point brings out something very, very interesting about Wittgenstein's character, and I guess in his self-belief as a person and as a philosopher. So if you or me, I guess, came up with a theory, and then we realised that this theory had this really crazy consequence, we might say to ourselves, yeah, that's probably a problem for my theory. I better go back to the drawing board and revise the theory. Wittgenstein realised that his picture theory has this crazy consequence, that all the stuff he was saying is actually meaningless. But he really believed in what he was saying, and he trusted his own ability as a philosopher to such a degree that he could say, well, my theory tells us that everything we're saying is meaningless, and thus it is so. All of this stuff is ultimately meaningless. And he extracted from that a whole way of looking at philosophy. So ultimately, I don't think that tells us that much about philosophy itself, but it does tell us something very interesting about Wittgenstein as a thinker. So there is so much more to say about Wittgenstein, about his thought and about his philosophy. If you want to see some more videos about that, go and have a look at this one over here. Thank you so much to all my Ko-Fi supporters for making this content possible, and thank you to you for watching this far. I really appreciate it, and I will see you guys back here soon.